On April 13, 2010, Cathedral Pacific Flight 780 set off from Wanda International Airport in Surabaya, en route to Hong Kong, Indonesia. The departure from the international airport conditions were standard, and they were expected to carry out a regular landing in just under 5 hours. However, a few hours into the flight, it became apparent to the crew members that this was going to, one of the engines will not fly on a regular flight, was found to have stopped completely while the other was stuck on high power. Unwilling to slow down, all passengers on board were now faced with a life-threatening situation above the South China Sea. What was supposed to be a regular flight was now in doubt of if the pilots could navigate this grave situation and successfully land the aircraft in Hong Kong. Situation was unprecedented, so it would have required nothing less than a miracle to salvage the situation. This is the chilling story of shortly after 8 p.m. on Cathay Pacific Flight 780 a.m. local time. On that fateful day, Cathay Pacific Flight 780 departed from the 8th location at the Wanda International Airport ready for takeoff, boarded on the Airbus A330, carried 309 people and 13 crew members, and of the 13 crew members, 2 pilots, including Captain, 35 years old Malcolm Waters, who had 12 years of experience flying with Cathay Pacific, as well as over 2,500 hours flying. He was accompanied by a 37-year-old A330 first officer, David Heho, who was 3 years into his stint at Cathay Pacific. After over a decade serving with the Royal Australian Air Force, Heho had about 1,000 hours of flight experience on the A330. The A330 aircraft used for the flight was approximately 11 years old and prevalent over the medium to long-term aviation market. Cathay Pacific had over 30 A330s in its fleet, which made them one of its largest carriers at the time. Both pilots had flown this particular A330 into Surabaya the previous night, so the captain requested that an extra 24,000 kilos of jet fuel be added on top of the 9,000 kilos available. As the journey to Hong Kong was around 3,500 kilometers long, the circumstances on the day of flight were good, and the weather was more or less perfect, with a forecast for clear skies. So everyone was expecting a smooth journey, but this would almost immediately change. The aircraft lifted off the runway at Surabaya at 1:24 a.m. UTC, with the first officer flying and the captain handling radio communications. However, during the climb, there was a first sign of what was to come, as the pilots noticed that both engines had begun to experience some engine pressure ratio fluctuations, especially for the second engine located at the right side of the aircraft. This showed that the engine was having issues maintaining the required thrust output, while maintaining thrust TR from a single engine was a tangible issue. It was one you would have expected the pilots to be able to navigate through, but it didn't end there, because just around 30 minutes later, a warning suddenly came up on the ECANM, or Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System, which displayed fault messages. It read Engine 2 Control System. Fault in Engine 2 slow response, meaning that the engine would be slow to respond to movements of the thrust lever, and with the aircraft cruising at about 39,000 feet above sea level, it became clear that this was no small concern. The captain contacted the Air Traffic Control Center for clarification on the fault readings. The situation with the right engine was the same, but since the readings from the other engine were deemed to be normal, the flight was passed safe to continue. The aircraft continued on its journey, but just over, around 3:16 an hour later, the control system fault message reappeared, along with a warning for the pilots to avoid rapid thrust changes. Once again, maintenance control was reached out to, and they came to the conclusion that the EPR instability may be due to a problem with engine number 2. Shockingly, though, the flight was permitted to travel to Hong Kong, despite the concerns with the crew advised to keep monitoring engine parameters. The plan was to get the aircraft to Hong Kong first, then run a check on and fix the engine issues after an additional 2 hours had passed. Without any more major incidents, the flight was now just over an hour away from its destination. But as soon as it was time, they would therefore discover that this was not going to be as simple as they first thought. At 5:20 UTC or 1:20 p.m. Hong Kong time, the aircraft was now 110 nautical miles from the Hong Kong first ever international airport descent and it looked like the situation had taken a turn for the worse at first. The pilot claimed to have heard a pop sound, which was followed by a burning smell in the cockpit. Then the ECAM displayed a message which read, "Engine 1 control system fault," and shortly thereafter, an additional message. Engine 2 stall. This second message showed that in the compressor stall in the engine was a potentially dangerous problem. The flight crew did what they had to do according to ECAM procedure and moved the idle lever for the second engine position. They then set the number 1 engine to maximum continuous thrust to make up for the second engine's inactivity. But unfortunately for the crew, the engine never reached its full capacity. Continuous thrust and could only achieve about 37% of the required thrust. They were now confronted with a terrible circumstance. As one of the engines had lost all power, while the other wasn't running at the required power, and they were now less than 100 miles from the airport without sufficient power. It was a huge task for the aircraft to maintain its altitude, and they were now on a crash course with the gravity of the South China Sea of their situation. The crew declared a pan with air traffic control in order to request a priority landing via the shortest possible route to the airport. Captain Malcolm took over the flight controls from First Officer David because the aircraft was now powered by single underpowered engine. The flight crew received permission from air traffic control to maintain a high speed to be able to reach the airport with a single engine approach. Things looked to be stabilizing, and they were preparing for a rough landing. However, a few minutes later now, only 45 nautical miles from the airport and approaching an altitude of 8,000 feet, a new ECAM message popped up that shocked the flight crew. Engine 1 stall. It read this time, the situation now was so precarious that the flight crew had to declare a Mayday. The crew were then granted permission to descend to 3,000 feet, and like they had done earlier with engine number 2, they moved the thrust lever for the first engine to idle position. This action basically changed the aircraft into a glider, but it still needed an engine that worked if it was to safely land at the airport. At this point, Captain Malcolm had switched off the autopilot and began to fly the plane manually in order to achieve the green dot speed of 202 knots, which guarantees the greatest glide distance in the case of multiple failed engines, just like this one. The captain began switching between levers to see if he might be able to regain control of either engine, which would have secured the landing at Hong Kong. Fortunately for Captain Malcolm, he was able to achieve some functionality in the first engine and used it to keep the aircraft in the air. But as the plane got close to the airport, the speed was still way too fast for the approach. So the captain began to pull the engine 1 thrust lever back once again, but it wasn't responsive. The engine thrust remained as high as 74%, and being so close to the ground, they now had to prepare for a landing way faster than what was deemed to be safe. In response to this, Captain Malcolm made a public announcement to the passengers to fasten their seatbelts as there was a small problem with the engines, significantly understating the seriousness of the matter situation. In reality, they were in grave danger of overrunning the runway and ending up in the sea. To improve their chances, the captain began to zigzag the aircraft to create some distance between the airport and extended the speed brakes to reduce the speed of the aircraft. But despite this, the aircraft was still way over the speed requirement and even began to sound the overspeed warning just 3 meters from and 1,000 feet above the runway. The aircraft was still moving at a speed of 230 knots, which was about twice what it was required to be. The speed brakes were recalibrated to avoid a heavy crash, but were adjusted just in order to slow the aircraft down some more. However, the aircraft was still traveling too fast, and the overspeed warning sounded once more as they were. The captain was quickly approaching the runway, had done enough to properly time the runway, but now had to control the impact because the aircraft was still really moving fast. This was almost impossible to do the aircraft around 1:45 p.m. Finally made contact with the runway at about 231 knots, almost double the required speed to land. This speed caused the aircraft to repeatedly bounce as it skidded across the runway. So the pilot deployed the thrust reversers. Unfortunately, though, only the number 1 engine thrust reversers were deployed as a result of Captain Malcolm's step to stop the now overheated brakes aircraft before it ran out of runway space. After a 2.5-kilometer battle to stop the aircraft from skidding past the runway, the pilots were finally able to bring it to an abrupt halt only over 300 m from the end of the runway, with 5 of the aircraft's 8 main wheel tires deflated. Captain Malcolm and First Officer David had successfully landed a plane going double the required speed to land. However, the rescue efforts weren't over, as the brake temperatures were now up to 90 degrees Celsius. Now there was a risk of a fire, but with fire crews on ground, reporting sights of smoke, the pilots were able to command an orderly evacuation of the 309 passengers on board. 56 of them escaped with minor injuries. One had more serious but non-fatal injuries, and the remaining passengers, in addition to the crew members, all escaped unhurt. The crew of Cathay Pacific flight, flying in a 33,000, had made an amazing landing. Cathay Pacific Flight 780 was no easy feat, as both pilots had not been trained for such a situation before the fact that, despite this, the crew members remained composed. Situation is testament to their courage and the ability to use their bravery and ingenuity. Both pilots were awarded the award for Polaris from the International Association of the Federation of Airline Pilots in 2000-2014. Investigations into the flight revealed that the cause of the accident was fuel contamination caused by superabsorbent polymer particles, or SAP. Apparently, the SAPs had caused the fuel system components to cease resting in a loss of thrust control for both engines. It was also during the flight revealed that the SAPs only contaminated because of the fuel supply. The fuel system pipeline system had not been properly maintained, which allowed salt water to enter and weaken the filter monitors. The result of compromised filters was the introduction of SAP particles to the fuel, with some of those particles trapped in the clearance of the moving paths of the fuel metering unit, causing stain in its control, causing the EPR to fluctuate ATIONs, as well as triggering the various ECAM readings. The final report sought to mitigate these issues by improving the procedures for fueling and supervision of fuel quality monitoring. Airbus made a contribution by inserting a new section in the A330 handbook for suspected engine fuel contamination of the system. So in the end, there was nothing the pilots could have done differently in the situation, as it was clearly a maintenance issue which could not easily have been detected. But they did what had to be done to ensure that no life was lost. So what are your thoughts on their heroics? Please let us know in the remarks below.